Some of my recordings are definitely more embarrassing than others in terms of their conceptual cogency and stuff, and this is definitely going to be one of the sort of the more egregious ones in terms of things being all over the place, because I'm not even going to refer to some of my prior claims properly because I can't remember exactly how I expressed them, but I was very keen about a model of sort of dissecting identity politics, describing how the identity itself is a kind of borderline personality disordered figure, and then the adherent or proponent of identity politics is the vulnerable narcissist, and they sort of work as a kind of internal codependency. I've since later found Sam Vaknin talking about very, very similar structures, which he could have been speaking about before I came across them. I'm not saying he plagiarized my work, not at all. Um, I think we're probably just very similarly on to similar tracks, and he also has had much more time sort of devoted just to this sort of thing, whereas my work on psychology I consider to be sort of generally, well, my models of personality and things like that are much more general. And indirectly, although I'm going to try to talk about some political things, I want this recording to somewhat be addressed to him, because I do think that there are things that uh, that he might find useful. Well, I was listening to a series of recordings which happened sort of during an encounter, a sort of an interview in someone's home or something like that, which was broken up into a whole lot of little clips, which is very useful as well, because each clip then can have its own heading as to a subject matter, and then they sort of work in sequence. But I disagree with some of the things that he said. I mean, the general outline of everything that he says seems to be very accurate. He's definitely describing real mechanics and things like that, but um, I think he is slightly too pessimistic when he describes the shrapnel of the fragmented narcissist, that their personality is fundamentally, sort of irre- irrevocably dispersed and complicated, and all, in terms of like sort of juxtaposing that against like a more normal development of someone's ego, that their ego is like irreparably um, dismantled and disarrayed and disordered. Um, anyway, okay, I'm gonna touch back on that, but first I'm just gonna get through some of the political analogy that I was getting into, which also touches on some of the things that Sam Vaknin was speaking about. Um, so. Uh, okay, so putting that to one side. It's the things which he states. I feel like I want to reiterate because they're important in almost the political dimension of trying to tackle the ideology of what I call this weird kind of identitarian vulnerable narcissism, which has this weird connection to its identity, or very similar to what Sam Vaknin when he talks about the false self of the narcissist or something like that. And then again, like this stuff is very interestingly modeled when he talks about how uh, borderline personality disorder that has narcissism is able to sort of use narcissism as a tactic in order to get around their borderline um, sort of weakness or sort of vulnerability to some extent. They use a kind of a vehicle of narcissism in order to at least not have their borderline pathology uh, exposed to being stimulated or because that is far more debilitating, let's just say, than the narcissistic alternative in terms of sort of the narcissistic tactic, which is almost like a modification layered around their their personality disorder. And I think also the other thing that I wanted to mention, which was directly what I saw him saying recently, is that narcissism should not be considered a personality disorder. That these people are fun, and he explains quite clearly and succinctly, and it's very prescient that you can't deal with narcissism as if it is a personality disorder, because which is it's also, he says also that it's a good thing that it's not a personality disorder, because personality disorders, essentially there are no treatment for them, there's no really getting better. The only exception is borderline personality disorder with the dialectical processing or dialectical therapy. I can't remember exactly I always forget what that phrase is, but which is slightly ironic because I don't know how long it's been around, but I mean, thinking about it's strange to insinuate things like this, so I'm just going to go right out and say it. I think I had a hand in developing that therapy. But I guess I need to look up at the history books to see if it even how recent it is, if that's even possible. But I remember sort of perhaps I reinvented it. Perhaps that's what happened. And then people found that there were talk of it before. But I remember being involved in some kind of psychological community to some extent, and dealing with certain experts and liaisoning with things. Anyway, let me just put all of that aside, but I think that's also quite prescient as well, because in as much as that borderline personality disorder can be analogized to what's happening ideologically, politically, or culturally or intellectually to the identitarian sort of movement, or whatever you want to call it, the kind of the post-structuralists who don't want to define themselves as post-structuralists because they don't like to think of themselves as relativists. So they want something else, the functional post-structuralists who have this, the only way to, I think, confront them with their bullshit, essentially, is to sort of subject them, and I'm talking about now in political rhetoric or whatever, is to somewhat therapeutic. You almost have to deal with them in terms of political rhetoric. You always have to, you have to therapeutically, dialectically diagnose their suggestions and their prescriptions and what they say. You have to parse it for them, parse. You have to parse what they are saying into this kind of dialectical, thing, and you have to keep good records of that, because otherwise you have no chance at ever sort of derailing the spiraling, the doom spiral and narrative which they are sort of orchestrating and narrating about the events around them, and you just get sucked into that vortex unless you are very clearly trying to sort of counter them with a dialectical sort of interpretation, so that they can't escape their own sort of internal objective, limitations and things like that. And that, I think, is a good analogy when you're dealing with proponents of decolonization and things like that. All that stuff applies directly. That's the kind of identitarian sort of borderline sort of conceptual outline that they are subtextually promoting, and that they are inherently invested in, and such, and that they are advocating. And sometimes it's hard to sort of track that, because people don't keep that intellectual record and append it to them and force them to generate a kind of dialectical reservoir that shows the incoherence and the ungrounded sort of flip-flopping that occurs within the mess of a philosophy that they have, and the mess that they've made of morality and everything. If you don't have a kind of dialectical approach to engaging with them, it just gets more and more perverse. It gets more and more corrupt. It gets more and more delusional, effectively, and deranged. And the more and more, essentially, that you allow them to capture what you're saying and project onto what you're saying, if you do try to engage with them without this sort of dialectical approach of trying to create that sort of a kind of an objective touchstone that can be at least sort of grounded in a dialectical sort of record of what it is that they're doing. You have to show them themselves in the dialectical mirror, as it were, tracking their failed lines of argument and sort of the self-agonizing, sort of circular tautological semantic corruption that they keep on perpetrating in order to conceal their convoluted relativistic premises and such. You're never going to make that relativism appear, or at least visible, if you allow yourself to be cast a role in their narrative, and then they just sort of cast you as the antagonist or the actually the ironic thing about it is that they actually cast you as the protagonist, because it's sort of everything has to be done in reaction to your first sort of I guess actually that is that analogy is a bit perhaps wishy-washy, because I would still think that fundamentally the problem with their whole schema is that they can never be the protagonist. They have to sort of settle for being a self-antagonist, and it's sort of because the protagonist is the narrative, and that is owned by some kind of opposing relativism, which then justifies their reactionary relativism, essentially, and they're forced to play this relativistic game because they didn't start the fire, and they just sort of take a reading of the situation and they say, no, it's an empirical fact, we don't have to philosophize about it. So they're always starting in the middle of a kind of philosophical muddling or whatever. But okay, excuse that huge rant, although I think it is quite descriptive and prescient. So you've got this kind of force taking over society. Culture, it's corrupting everything. It's corrupting academia. It's corrupting the legal theory. It's corrupting politics. It's corrupting even artistic expression of narrative. You can't have TV series that don't, and you can't have journalistic stories that don't sort of conform to the formulaic kind of cherry-picked because it's such a brittle kind of orthodoxy that requires everything is facilitating the destruction of the moral consideration of the individual, that the individual cannot be considered as having dignity or integrity. It's only the individual as an identity, because we are forced into that kind of reactionary ad hoc sort of ethnocentric relativism or something like that in order to facilitate the prescription. So it's a weird kind of self-referential, sort of necessitating imposition and enforcement of their dogma, which you can't even think about it without sort of already allowing yourself to be hooked into their thing, and then because you've already sort of issued the same prescription, which is the test to see if the whole sort of framework even is operative. It's sort of like a runaway. You're sort of in the process. You're in the process of aiding and abetting a sort of a train heist in progress or something like that. Okay, stupid analogy. Okay, let me just get back to what I was saying. So the reason why was I saying all of that? I was saying that because I wanted to say that in as much as that you can link the intellectual side of this to borderline personality disorder, I think it is correct that essentially it's a good analogy to use that the only personality disorder that actually has a successful therapy attached to it is the dialectical thing, whatever it's called. Is the dialectical therapy, and that I think needs to be, the lesson of that needs to be absorbed politically, and that will actually be a very positive influence, because there is like a lot of, let's say, self-delusion in politics in general. It is how a lot of corruption occurs, and if we as a culture can work out how to immunize ourselves against these evils, against these self-deranging self-deceptions and things like that, and self-deluding sorts of things that manifest on a macro scale as a kind of collective narcissism to some degree. We as a species, as a culture, as a civilization, if we're vigilant to that extent, we will be able to get back to the steady sort of kind of progress that we had as a communal vision almost, which enjoyed the cultural hegemony in the 90s. The non-racialist humanistic kind of temperament. The kind of the original idea of Star Trek essentially, and such. That I think we can find our ways back to that. Okay, anyway, that's all aside. Now, what I wanted to say to Sam Vaknin. Okay, so now I've just sort of imported a lot of his wonderful thinking and tried to make it somewhat politically analogous to what needs to happen. I'm just going to suggest some things which might be, I don't know how easy it will be for him to consider or integrate or whatever, because I probably have some models of personality style which are not the same as his. I mean, I personally think, for instance, that all false egos, and I'm not talking about the narcissistic false ego or false self. What I call false ego, other people might just call personality style. I think all personality styles are fundamentally pathological. Obviously, there are gradients of pathology, and what we're even measuring that against, is not even is some kind of utilitarian function. It's not internal consistency or something like that. And I think even, let's say, being envious of some kind of typical average false ego, I don't see that. I mean, you can talk about being well adjusted or something like that. I mean, there are people that are broken, certainly, and they suffer for their brokenness, and they make the people around them suffer for them. Conceding all of that, humanity, let's just say, or personality, the psyche itself, is I believe it's the final frontier. It's the only frontier to some degree. To somewhat use spiritual analogies and things like that. And we do need to start making our way towards understanding psychology, and doing what we can to develop to develop consciousness, self-actualization, and things like that. And so, I mean, my models don't probably have that within their purview. They have that within their capacity to sort of try to navigate towards them. But anyway, there are certainly psychological devices that can be fashioned. There are things that can be communicated and shared. There are things that can be developed. Okay, so let me just put this in context. So what I'm saying is that people, for example, even narcissists, and I do think Sam Vaknin correctly says that narcissists never grow up. Now, from my model, I would just say that just means that they are super ego focused, and the super ego is very much, or they're unconscious. They're generally unconscious focused, or between unconscious and super ego. But at least being unconscious focused, they are closer to the super ego. To me, the super ego is special because it is somewhat the original self before the false ego developed. So before the false ego complex, the personality style sort of establishes itself, you have to have, let's say, your base self that inducted itself into a process which then became like an internal emotional argument, and you kind of got stuck in that loop. Now, what I'm basically saying is that a narcissist, for instance, which Sam Vaknin correctly says is someone who was stuck in childhood, they never became an adult. That means that they have very poor developed egos. Their egos are problematic. Now, I do think that you do need to have some level of ego repair in order to actually alleviate the false ego complex, because the ego has very particular keys in sort of unlocking the superego. But being unconscious focused, you can still do things from the unconsciousness on the superego, and in fact it does have a window of self-understanding which is more accessible from that angle. So I do think that there are some benefits, but you do need to do something about the ego, or get something sort of in league with the ego, or anyway. And I understand that, Sam Vaknin says, the ego is exploded, it's shrapnel or whatever. You can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. Now, I think within certain models, like mine, for instance, you might be able to work out what the ego would have done if you have a general formulation of how the false ego can be resolved, or how it can sort of be processed out, or something like that. And then you have ways of describing different personality styles and the different, let's say, components of those false egos. Then you can sort of work out what the ego would have done in that recipe of resolution. Okay. And if you know what it could have done in that resolution, and I must say, even people that have well-functioning egos, they're not necessarily in, let's say, the right kind of, I don't know how to make an analogy for this, but essentially, just having a normal ego doesn't mean that, having a stable false ego, I think, is a very pathological thing. And I think usually it's stabilized not even from the ego, it's stabilized from the subconscious. And most people, especially in their elderly years, become very subconscious focused. They essentially are living out a kind of weird kind of, they're trying to reduce the strain on their ego, because the ego is actually a very resentful kind of thing. And I do think that almost, it's probably, strictly speaking, incorrect to say that narcissists, like, their egos are exploded. It's more, I think it's actually that their egos are actually even functioning quite well because of, let's say, the prominence that the superego has for the narcissist. It's probably the subconscious that's completely fucked up and sort of completely dispersed. And because their subconscious can't take the edge off their ego, then they're only left essentially with the negativity that the ego portends. Because the ego is probably it's in most people, it's the most controlling, but also it is the most negative. It's in my model, and I've actually changed some of these names around, but I've now used the four sides of the mind names or terms. The ego is your actual stream of consciousness, in terms of, like, when you think in your head, when you actively think in your head, and your subconscious is something like the kind of the mood and the tone and the sort of and your whim around, and sort of your tone of motivational inclination that sort of impresses upon you. Okay, this is a bit of a simplification. I realize I'm getting all over the place, but anyway, another better way of saying all of this is actually just to describe an actual illustration of a process of how you would work this stuff out. And I'm going to use a kind of Christian metaphor to some degree. The Christian doctrine, I believe, is completely misunderstood. There's almost nothing resembling Christianity anywhere. But at least my take on how it's actually supposed to work, and the hard lessons that Jesus teaches, and when you get into the metaphysics, it's actually much more interesting. And the metaphysics essentially is that the Son of God is just the understanding. That's all it is. It's the mind itself, the true mind, as it were, the self-realized mind. That is the Son of God. And some things are weirdly phrased. Like when it says, "For God so loved the world." Like, why is it talking about God and the world? Like, what do human beings have to do with the world? Talking about God and the world is a completely sort of obtuse. That God in that context is a kind of a priori philosophical God. That's almost a purely metaphysical construct. So, and context that whole scripture relates to, "For God so loved the world," and then essentially, "For God so loved the world, He gave His only Son." That's the understanding. So, but how does that understanding actually manifest in creation, let's just say, or incarnated? So in some sense, "For God so loved the world," that context is showing you the why, how reason can be sort of structured in pure metaphysics when you're thinking about God disconnected from an actual incarnation. How this actually came to be is, you have to go into John's creation depiction, or two spirits went out into the world, And so the understanding is made from two spirits. The discerning spirit has to discern between two metaphysical things. And essentially that is God and not God, the spirit of God and the spirit of man. So it really, it all hinges on the understanding. The understanding is the incarnated, let's say, okay, I'm getting all over the place. But anyway, the reason why I'm talking about the understanding is that understanding is a prerequisite of love, and sort of in pure understanding, true understanding, will sort of embrace love and have an affinity with love. And there, what you can sort of overlook quite badly is that when you are trying to look at, let's say, the average functional human being in their false ego, they have actually stabilized their false ego out of generally sympathy, some kind of reservoir of sympathy, which allows people to do very hideous things. Actually, this is how bad things happen. Is essentially because of the emergence of sympathy. There's this gap between self-knowledge and it fulfills this weird kind of vicarious role within the psyche, where you can hypothetically sort of dilute somebody else's pain or something like that, or burden. You're going to hypothetically dilute that, and at the same time it's sort of going to allow you to feel that hypothetically you're doing something about it. Essentially, this is the kind of thing that, for example, the identity and identity politics sort of, it solves this problem in some sense, that you can have lazy thinking and you can still feel like that you're part of the solution or something like that, or that you're in league with being on the right side of it somehow. Anyway, the reason why I'm talking about sympathy is that when you sort of create this, which you can sort of excuse yourself by saying, oh, I'm being sympathetic with somebody else, and then it sort of creates this machine in which you can expect other people to be sympathetic with you, and then it just becomes the sort of encapsulation of self-deception and self-delusion, and it allows you to fudge being not happy with self-knowledge, or it allows you to sort of escape self-knowledge, and essentially. And essentially, it's the obstacle to understanding. So I'm not saying empathy is bad. I'm saying sympathy is quite corrosive and poisonous and contagious. And it's more contagious in terms of the culture, the kind of intellectual culture, or the impact that it has on reason itself. Because essentially you can give someone sympathy instead of actually doing something about it, instead of actually working out from first principles how you could actually be part of a real solution rather than part of this sort of like imaginative solution that you're enacting in your sympathy instead. And so it allows you to sort of calcify your internal structures and sort of have them be kind of good enough, because you can just sort of vaguely emulate some kind of ideal that the sympathy symbolizes. And so you're actually sort of, it's a kind of idolatry, I believe. Anyway, the reason why I'm telling you this is because the actual cure to this is spelled out in the scriptures. Jesus says, you must hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and even your own life just to be worthy to be a disciple of mine. So just to be worthy to be a disciple, you must use hate. And hate really is the solution. And this hate is not an active hate. It's an intellectual hate. If you can hate everything, then you can know the cost of everything, as it were. You can, if you hate every fragment of yourself, if you hate, you will start to track the consequences of everything. You will know how everything is correlated with everything else. That gives you a kind of universal objective standard or measure or way of evaluating everything. Then you add that with some kind of communion. You add that with other people that are doing the same thing. Then you can actually communicate in a universal way, in some sense. You can actually share technology between different psyches. You can share insight between different psyches, because they're both committed to having a clear and transparent understanding because it's founded on hate. Hate is the binding agent, as it were. The negative consequences, the dark sayings of the Lord. This is what allows us to actually have real knowledge, and that allows us to make real advancement and progress in which we can actually help each other. So, this kind of hate that I'm talking about is almost like a kind of stoicism as well. Now, in the same way that you can hate all your fragments or your egoistic shrapnel, right? Now, using hate as a bonding agent, you can use those parts the way they need to be used, perhaps, if you have at least an outline of what you need to be building with them, and you can get the job done, and perhaps we can slay the false ego. But that is a wider, more general project that is wider than just overcoming narcissism. Anyway. So I did want to depict all of that because I think that it might be a useful inspiration or knowledge, to some degree, or I mean it might be an interesting sort of way of picturing the problem that can perhaps allow for a more creative or inventive, getting around what Sam Vaknin obviously sees. But I mean, this is one step further, I guess, than merely trying to cure narcissism or normalize narcissism. It comes with trying to slay a different beast, what I refer to as the false ego, which is not the same thing as what Sam Vaknin refers to as the false self, which is bounded within the kind of the model of a narcissistic the mapping of narcissism. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to get through. There was another sort of point that I wanted to make, which I didn't emphasize in my last video when I was sort of giving as many illustrations as I could about some philosophical, intellectual contentions about epistemic agency and epistemic injustice and things like that, and talking about how the philosophy around epistemic responsibilism is being badly contorted by this kind of identitarian fad in academia and such, as being polluted by this narcissism and such, or however you want to depict it. And I just wanted to get into explaining more about the British political analogy of how they basically fixed this in terms of setting up their constitution, which I gave a really good depiction of this, so I don't want to try and repeat it because I'm not going to do as good a job, but I just wanted to neaten it up slightly in terms of they really use political realism to emphasize the value of epistemic agency. That because, for example, the supremacy of the British Parliament means that essentially it's important that you elect the right people that are going to have the right cultural value in maintaining the moral consideration and value and importance that the individual has. Because essentially Parliament has the power essentially to degrade and obstruct those values and like free speech and things like that. So because within their political framework they are allowed to deprive themselves of free speech if a majority of their population aren't, let's say, interested in voting people in that have the moral consideration of the individual at the core of their cultural ethos. It shows you how essentially they preserve, not in the letter of the law, but in the spirit of the law, how it is hinged on essentially the value of epistemic agency, in that, like, you actually have to conduct your epistemic agency. It's not going to be enforced by a kind of legal positivism. It's up to you. It's up to you individuals to keep it, as it were. And it just sort of it reinforces. Let's say it has a philosophical symmetry to it, which is quite beautiful. And I just wanted to add that point to how I depicted it, because actually depicted it quite nice, but I felt bad that I didn't emphasize that symmetry about it. Um, yeah, so I sadly I didn't do a good job of re depicting it, but sort of if you it's that like 2 hour recording that has a lot of repetition and things like that, or it's yeah, because it's sort of it's called like epistemic responsibilism and the corruption of it by identitarian something, and then it has a part two, and then this I'm going to sort of try and tack onto that. Okay, yeah, that's about it. Just to emphasize that last point, the thing that the symmetry is depicting, which I just realized I didn't even elaborate properly, is that the epistemic agent is its only insurer for itself, and it's sort of it's not you know and it only contends with the living, essentially, like it only contends with the living culture, as it were. So if there's something in it that has been irreparably lost, well, it doesn't have a flag bearer. I'm not describing this delicately enough, but and that reminds me of another point that I left out in the psychology sort of section, that people that are delicately broken, or at least in terms of the actual underlying structure of the ego and such, that those are quite, let's say, delicate. Okay, anyway, that's more of just a poetical sort of description of trying to, that it's almost a bit of a, to use the word metaphorically, a bit of a godsend that we have delicately broken people, because it allows us to and scenarios that are delicately broken, because it requires a level of sophistication. It requires the engineering and the development of enough understanding to clearly sort of navigate and to sort of get to grips with what's actually going on in those deep recesses that are otherwise go ununderstood, or misunderstood rather. But yeah, the thing about this, okay, going back to the symmetry, in the British realism of how their politics is structured, and their political economy is fundamentally structured, is that it does all hinge on the living epistemic agency that is currently immediately in the works, and if it's not capable of, let's say, generating a culture that is concerned with conserving its own epistemic agency, then so be it. It's going to lose it. But it's on the epistemic agency itself. It's on the articulation of epistemic agency itself. It is all hinged on that. There is no sort of there's no excuse. There's no buck to be passed around and say, oh, the system didn't let us do it, or whatever. I mean, if you want to account for something that has been a travesty or a tragedy or something like that you're part of this thematic thing, well, can it be expressed by an epistemic agent? Can they convince other epistemic agents to endorse some kind of adaptation to the culture or something like that, the culture that those epistemic agents are doing, without corroding, let's say, the substrate of the value of epistemic agency itself that's vested in the individual? Can they do that? And essentially there's nothing, because Parliament is sovereign, there's no sort of way of getting around that, that it's up to the people, essentially. I mean, you can argue it's up to the people collectively in a somewhat of a majoritarian generalization to continue to revere the culture of epistemic of the epistemic agency residing in the individual in order to sort of, so again, like in some sense, it isn't concretely in the system itself, um, without you actually without you believing that it is. It does actually require, let's say, the articulation of good faith. It requires actually contending it into being in some sense, into making that the canonical interpretation. So in some sense, it doesn't positivistically reside within the system. Um, and this somewhat has to do with the question of faith itself. With if you're going to be a reductionist and say that, or reduce everything into a sociological construct or something, and just say no, it's all a kind of historical drama of these ethnocentric themes and relativisms, and if you're going to create a kind of obtuse thing that is going to fundamentally instrumentalize epistemic agency into some kind of ideological idolatry or something like that, or ideological reduction. Whereas the kind of British political realism, like, fundamentally doesn't get into those games, because it just says, well, it's up to the individual to look out for preserving the container of the individual, in some sense. Okay, I think I've done this could all be stated more elegantly, but I think that's crudely what I'm trying to. That's pretty much it, I guess. I hate having to say very clumsy things, as probably what I'm going to say, just for ease of being able to talk about the theory, I guess, and at least how I'm modeling this stuff. I made some notes just to sort of neaten up some things. So this is, just to emphasize some things that maybe didn't come out conceptually that clearly. So, in talking about the necessity to sort of use a kind of dialectical behavioral therapy against proponents of identity politics, and who promote essentially the that conceptual agenda, which I am saying is quite complicated, because I think the identity has borderline personality disorder, and the adherent essentially is exercising a kind of vulnerable narcissism on behalf of that identity. But it is also kind of complicated because it kind of, as a functioning political ideology, let's just say, or even like a philosophical or intellectual model to be a part of, you can almost have the best of all worlds, because you can just sort of, you can almost escape that perniciousness to some degree by merely just leveling it all against the scapegoat and making the scapegoat the cause of your of this internal system, or this. Anyway, okay, I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole so much, but it does facilitate levels of murkiness and self-deception, which I guess these things are almost natural permutations within borderline personality disorder, but it's more easily disguised when it's manifesting as a collective complex, as it were, like a collective pathological psychological complex, which I think is what you should think of when you think of totalitarian societies, more so the fascist totalitarian society. It is interesting that it almost subtextually also works within the kind of Leninistic totalitarianism, but there it's more rationalized, and it's almost it's rationalized consciously, whereas in fascism, as with this current trend of identitarian sort of ideology, is much more fascistic at its intellectual and emotional sort of interface that it has with its adherents. But anyway, I mean, I do think Hitler would have just called these identitarians, depending on what level they were at, he would just call them useful idiots. I would technically refer to them as proto-fascist, because they essentially spread the fascistic conception of the individual and society, or whatever. That they spread the fascistic worldview and the fascistic value system and philosophy, essentially, but they can't sort of completely consign themselves over to it because they like having the internal flux. So they're more associated with the identity's borderline personality disorder than having fully developed the vulnerable narcissism that its, let's say, natural affective proponent would do. So they're almost like they didn't quite make it out of the cocoon. They didn't quite make it out of the chrysalis. So they're sort of stuck in this semi-metamorphosis where they want to sort of try to have it always. They want to have their cake and eat it. They just want to continue to complain about the scapegoat and not actually get into a container that is actually capable of actuating its supposed, kind of conceptual outlook or vision or whatever, which is fundamentally sort of confused. But anyway, the intellectual side of even the hardened adherents of this still then I think can be tackled in terms of, like, let's say, their internal premise or whatever, which is that borderline personality disorder. So that, I think, is what needs to be contended or when you're confronting the ideology. And you have to do it through something like a dialectical behavioral therapy, which is used for people that have borderline personality disorder. Now, if you actually look up dialectical behavioral therapy, because I didn't elaborate on this point, so I'm going to elaborate on it now. Because the analogy might seem to be slightly weird, because it's like, it's called behavioral therapy. So that's a bit strange already, but so I'm just going to sort of give commentary how it can be politically sort of translated into, like, how to go about it, or not in its direct practice, but just sort of how to conceive of it, how to conceptually sort of see it. So in the dialectical behavioral therapy, what is actually happening is that you're trying to ground the conceptual turmoil and disarray into an actualized dialectical order. What I'm also describing is probably a lot of how cold therapy is sort of structured to some degree. I think cold therapy probably, whatever, what do you call it, proprietary elements it has, it's probably more, and whatever sort of therapies it has built into it, I do think that there is probably, in some overarching thematic way, probably its largest inspiration could be probably depicted as dialectical behavioral therapy, although it perhaps it's situated in a sandwich, where you have to go through important other steps before and after that component. But I do think that it's sort of like, it's one of the pivotal things that you have to sort of get right in order to make the cold therapy work. That's sort of my conjecture. I guess I might have forgotten to some degree, but I believe that I have, in the past, had conversations about this directly with Sam to some degree. And I don't want to claim that I developed all of it, but I do think, or even a large portion of it, or even a significant portion of it, but I believe that I probably helped refine some of the thinking. I don't know. That's very embarrassing to sort of communicate in that sort of strange way. But anyway, let me just get on to the point. Well, this is a memory that, these are memories and references that I believe are true, but I hate having to report these sorts of things like that, and phrased in that way. It sounds so ludicrous, but anyway. So in dialectical behavior, okay, the reason why I'm trying to explain dialectical behavioral therapy, because I believe that this kind of logic needs to be applied in somewhat political rhetoric, or at least a political tactic, in creating a polemic in order to illustrate the kind of the nefarious implicit corruption involved in such, in the identitarian sort of worldview and such, and also the poisonous or toxic contagion that their prescriptions sort of facilitate and such. Okay, So because essentially they've got this sort of conceptual disarray internally, the kind of the post-structural paradox or conundrum, to some degree, or the kind of that they don't want to be relativistic, but they are functionally relativists and such like that. They have to believe in some kind of ethnocentrism or something like that, which they can only sort of excuse themselves as saying becomes a kind of imperative based on some kind of historical thumb-sucked, sort of substantiation, which is always contrived by some kind of hysterical, cherry-picked, sort of meandering narrative that has such a narrow outlook in order just to confirm this prescription or this general formulaic necessity in order to give people this reactionary sort of valence to live through or whatever, or to further their to be the vanguard of their interests, to be the sort of the bulwark of their life aspirations or whatever. But it ends up attracting and sucking up all their life energy, as it were, or representing all their life energy, so that it can then be made paramount and be used as a political weapon. But okay, anyway, so I've just got in parentheses here a description of what dialectical behavioral therapy is: creating a dialectic between. And so when I say that it's seeking to ground the conceptual turmoil and disarray into an actualized dialectical disorder. Actualized, I mean, because that is sort of what is being talked out in the therapy. That is what, that you're actually moving from a hypothetical conceptual framework into like actually imagining an actualized expression or manifestation or course of events or whatever. And therefore, dialectical, when I say into an actualized dialectical order, dialectical there is just an adjective, and I still need to explain why it's dialectical, and an order because essentially you are grounding things by depicting them in actualized, sort of scenarios, and thereby through the dialectic. Okay, and now I open the parentheses and the dialectic between the convoluted internal model that the borderline directs and manipulates absolutely versus the consideration of a tangible illustration that ends up developing a bounded compass sort of at its first contact, but then it eventually sort of transmutes into a relegation of the borderline conceptual tendency or the reliance on borderline conceptualization. That there's a kind of when I say that the conceptual tendency, I mean that absolute internal manipulation of a kind of ideal outlines or whatever, or some, essentially, this is better depicted as like there's an internal chessboard that is being played autistically by an autistic, diabolical, sort of Machiavellian sort of supercomputer, as it were, which is in fact a kind of I think both borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality, or it's not a personality disorder, but the construct of narcissism, what it's actually representing is a kind of absolutism which is projected onto the subconscious. Some kind of concrete, formulaic, absolutist, sort of tactic, which is sort of being engineered before the false ego complex. So it's being engineered and being grounded by the superego, that there's a special relationship between the superego and the subconscious, and that is what, and that special, almost incestuous internal dynamic, which paradoxically makes the subconscious inaccessible to the false ego complex, and therefore you have this delicate disruption between the subconscious and the other sides of the mind. Because I think that there are the kind of narcissistic and borderline stress that is experienced internally is not just essentially the disarray that the subconscious is taking. It's that there's a reverberated internal disquieted, sort of unsettling between the subconscious and the superego itself. So although it's sort of to the rest of the sides of the mind, it is putting up a kind of a concrete front, there are internal problems, which is this kind of, because it's so shoddily conceptually done, it can't even almost maintain and sustain its own internal things, because the external things aren't mirroring and reflecting its internal composition, or the circuitry or relationship between the superego and the subconscious is like fundamentally unsound. And anyway, you can start to sort of curb those internal conflagrations by creating a kind of dialectical knowledge, and that can be used to found a kind of dialectical order that can start to regulate and mediate between the subconscious and the superego. Okay, sorry, I'm getting too much into the psychology sort of part of this, but and by doing this, you can probably, perhaps, at least in a simulated way, you can start to emulate the rest of the sides of the mind, can start to sort of develop anyway, and then, I did just use the word delicate again. I wanted to actually make a point about what I was trying to say, because it came out a bit sloppily, I think. But when I talk about, I think I said something about the delicate break or something like that, or the delicate brokenness, but I guess I'm trying to sort of distinguish between two things, that because on some level, on some sort of meta structure or meta-analysis of how the mind is structured, that the dysfunction is fundamentally simple, and somewhat even delicate within its own, within, what's the word, propping up or maintaining its own delicate, sort of disordered complication that is being added to the false ego complex. That fundamental thing is quite a delicate sort of thing, and that it has sophisticated implications, and it is that sort of sophistication that is generating the profundity and severity of the kind of impacts and consequences that it manifests, in the person's own life, but also in the people around them. Anyway, so I just wanted to sort of save that sort of illustration that I was trying to make about it being delicate, is that I guess because I do think that it does leverage us towards a finer understanding of these internal structures and things like that. And it can provide, let's say, specialist insight to a large degree into how these things are structured. So all of this sort of stuff goes without saying. I'm sure Sam Vaknin is very much aware of this already. I guess I wanted to, talk more about the hate thing that I was trying to get into. So I think that to some degree, what I said might already be captured by cult therapy to a large extent. So I'm perhaps not contributing anything when I talk about hate in that very specific sort of way. Suffice to say is that intellectual enterprise can start small. The idea that you're going to try in your mind the hate of everything, one thing at a time, cataloging it and increasing it one thing at a time, and even hating your own ability, let's just say, to even question your own existential point of contact with your own framing of your own consciousness. You can get into many, many meta levels. And that is something that you can build catalogs of. And once you've got sort of those internal items demarcated, and you have familiar, I can never say this word nicely, familiarity with those sorts of itemized objects within your mind, and it is almost a systemic objectification. And if you can do that dispassionately, so I do think that there is something about the narcissistic tendency towards objectification, which can even be salvaged. It can be used as a tool of, I guess the problem with the narcissistic objectification is that it is speciously constrained and bounded within like certain rules, which it can't it's so self-deceptive that it can't even see those. But like if you can sort of break out and hate everything evenly, then you can actually start to see the relative importance and pertinence that things have on each other, and how you can map how things are networked and how things can be coordinated. You can map levels of possible integration and how models function and such. Anyway, Sam Vaknin sort of, I think, covers this to some degree when he talks about idealism. I do think that everyone has that kind of idealism. It just, again, it is emphasized more in the narcissistic sort of schema. I believe that the kind of idealism that he speaks about is what the unconscious mind fundamentally works on. Most people are unconscious of their unconscious mind. I believe narcissistics are less unconscious of it because they are somewhat super ego focused or unconscious focused. They can't really get out of that seat of consciousness. Like in as much as that they're in their false ego complex, I believe they're situated in the unconscious part of the mind, side of the mind rather. Which means that they can they're more conscious of their beliefs, and you can sort of call that the idealistic self-reflective, sort of modeling or whatever. And I think what sort of the active sort of hate does, or the increasing the hate, allows you to sort of granularly break up those ideal structures into such a way is that you can then direct them freely to build anything. And obviously how you're going to structure actually what it is that you will build, well, now you need a new model of how to conceptualize the self, or like you need to premise it on something, or you need some kind of metaphysics or philosophy or something like that, or some kind of moral, or rather, let me say, ethical procedure and ambit or something like that. Anyway, this is getting much too sort of metaphysical. Let me get back to the dialectical behavioral therapy. I mean, sort of the powers of the unconscious mind are essentially only a necessity because of the false ego complex in general. But there is something to the quality. Okay, I said I was moving on, but I'm not yet. The quality of that idealism, I think, does approximate, let's say, the neutral and natural ability that that even helped to, let's say, construct the false ego complex before the false ego complex was established within, let's say, the infant's or the child's mind, or at least before it started taking root. I do think that somewhat the development of false ego, what I call the false ego, is somewhat natural because, and this is so messy to include this here, but let me just say it, is that incarnated understanding is going to have to discern between at least two things, and you're going to have to come to grips with the spirit of man. I'm not sure if it's possible to come to grips with the spirit of man without, what's the word, graduating through it, as it were, without sort of embroiling yourself in it and then transcending it and self-actualizing sort of after having sort of overcome it, and which is perhaps also a continual challenge to some degree in an existential sense, although in a psychological sense doesn't have to continue to be a confrontational internal grappling at all. But it is something that sort of gives you a route to graduating from it. Sort of like in the scene in The Matrix when Neo gets taken over by Agent Smith and then sort of comes out from within it, as it were. But and by the way, the Matrix itself, I think, is the best analogy. The interface of the ego with the Matrix can be seen as like, or the interface between the between the ego side of the mind and the subconscious side of the mind is like the human society Zion interfacing with the Matrix, which is the subconscious, and then sort of Neo growing up from his sort of every time he goes back into the Matrix, it's not just like, trying to unlock superpowers and using his powers inside the Matrix. It's like there's a meta story, there's a meta narrative that involves, let's say, the genesis of all of this, which is metaphorically speaking the superego. And the unconscious mind is very much like the machines themselves, to a large extent, in the architect, what the architect of the Matrix symbolizes. It's a very good depiction of it all, but why was I talking about this again? Is it something like that? get horribly distracted by background noise. Okay, the reason I was talking about that was I was talking about the necessity of developing the false ego. Yeah, I'm not going to touch on the subject for too much, but yeah, I mean, I hate sort of vaguely using archetypal, scriptural, doctrinal, sort of elements and things like that, but I don't want to spend too much trying to sort of. So I'm just going to sketch this, but basically, when it talks about man and woman, Adam and Eve, being expelled from the Garden of Eden, it says that there's a cherubim with a sword that turns every way and it guards the way to the tree of life, and it is posted at a certain direction from the entrance to Eden. So it sort of it guards. I can't remember which direction it is. It guards sort of the east entrance, or it guards the west entrance. But essentially, I believe that direction somewhat symbolizes that you have to go through that sword in order to. You have to face that particular cherubim if you want to enter back into the tree of life. To gain access to the tree of life, you have to go through that way. But there might be other ways which don't really apply to people that already have false egos. That there might be other ways that apply to people who never develop false egos, or if there's a way to sort of supplement. There might be another way to get to the tree of life, as it were, if we lived in a society or a civilization that had the kind of psychological insight and understanding in which people never developed false egos in the first place. But that is, I'm just saying that. But anyway, that makes me sound like a crackpot. But anyway, but yeah, I just wanted to refine this concept of hate to some degree. Hate is a necessary requisite for the understanding, so that the understanding can facilitate actual love and admiration and self-knowledge and such, and self-actualization. Yeah, and this has to do with some of my metaphysical claims around how conceptual structures themselves operate, introverted thinking, as the Jungian expressed in the Jungian cognitive function, that the most primordial introverted thinking, because in my model there's more than one more than one expression of many of the cognitive functions. Because to me they're unique to the dimensions of psychological reality, of which there are 17, not merely 8. But I've sort of given them cognitive functions just to better sort of visualize, I guess, how each of those dimensions operates in tandem within one another, sort of wheels within wheels. But one of the early dimensions, the third dimension of psychological reality, is introverted thinking, and that's the kind of introverted thinking that I think where this importance of hate is, which Jesus even cites as a requisite, that you cannot be a disciple until you hate everything that you're otherwise attached to. That you can still perhaps even be affiliated with it, but you have to also hate it in order to gain access to this kind of potential knowledge, because you can't know things about things that you are affiliated with. Now, this is essentially also where the conceptual outlines, and for example, borderline personality disorder, at least in the political analogy of identitarian relativism, whatever, this is the sort of thing that they destroy. Is they say, no, you must love your identity. That is the solution to the self-love. You're kind of breaking down. You're saying, no, there is something that you're not allowed to hate because it is the representative of the solution, or something like that. This means that you have like a worldly attachment, which which your understanding is not allowed to penetrate. So I mean, it's effectively it's an idolatry, and it becomes your God, and it becomes the central ordinal linchpin of your beliefs. How was I describing the unconscious mind? I was describing it as what was I just saying? I mean, I said it was analogously like the architect from the Matrix, but how was I referring it to just before? That it becomes unconscious, and that it is most closely linked to, was most closely linked to a lot of other sort of archetypal objects like the knowledge of good and evil and such, but and the lust and the death. What else? Damn it, getting distracted. Oh, the idealism. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the unconscious mind is very much the kind of capacity that Sam Vaknin is describing when he talks about idealism, and I basically say that all false egos have that idealism, but they're more unconscious of it because they have, let's say, a more integrated and developed ego, whereas narcissists are much more immediately confronted with that power of idealism. Which I do think that kind of idealism does actually become more prominent the more self-knowledge one aggregates, the more one is able to sort of fathom within the structures of the false ego, even if you did have a fairly normal structure of your sides of the mind and the ego, whatever. If it was more integrated, you still end up accessing, let's say, that idealism. It might be more bounded within, because you can know the integrated internal circuitry of how, what you do with that is going to have a consequence in terms of the a framing consequence in terms of how that idealistic belief structure and things like that, and sort of the rules that you make are going to end up constraining your conscious thoughts and your active articulation of your stream of consciousness, not just the sort of the mood, the underlying sort of motivational sort of mood music of your stream of consciousness, which is often in a kind of dissonance. People are often either people are most, let's say, they feel most solid when they are very clearly and sustainably able to be drunk on their subconscious, essentially, when they're able to sort of be carried by their feelings. I think narcissists, particularly, they don't ever experience the subconscious as a positive thing because it's so directly controlled by the superego or directed by the superego, which is quite empowering to the idealism in the unconscious side of the mind. And the ego essentially is being ravaged by the residue and consequence and the sort of the cascading outplay of these sort of the prominence of these other features of the other sides of the mind. And I think the thing that is actually facilitating what Sam Vaknin describes as the dispersal and the explosion and the shrapnel of the fragmented ego, which I do think is can be seen in two ways. It's either because the ego and the subconscious can't really be differentiated in terms of functional terms, because there is even overlap, but there is a kind of sort of when you sort of put your hands together and your fingers are intertwined, they're layered and sort of what's the word, interwoven in that kind of analogy. But because I kind of now have described it both ways. I've said that essentially they have a functioning ego, but they have a kind of a passively imprinted subconscious that is being projected on or being contorted by the superego, and that this also can be said the other way, in that their ego is just sort of a thorn, because it is representing the hurt that the subconscious is like fundamentally because the subconscious is being like fundamentally disrespected, essentially, as an independent side of the mind that would naturally be co-joined or be in a conjunction with the ego. It's instead being in a conjunction with the superego. And so the ego is just sort of picking up the pieces. Okay, so now I'm just repeating myself in different words, but or is left with the aftermath of whatever that leads to. But whatever the special relationship between the superego and the subconscious leads to. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I know the way I was just thinking of a way of actually how to reverse the fragmentation and the shrapnel and put it back together to some degree, and then is to somewhat feel with the fragments, let's say the fragmented ego, is to track with those fragments the fundamental confusion and fragmentation of how the subconscious is being puppeted by the superego. And in some sense, that is, let's say, the feeling of a kind of a distraughtness, of a kind of a fundamental, so you're going to sort of, when this thing gets resuscitated into a feeling body, which the subconscious fundamentally is, it's going to be like fundamentally eviscerated. It's going to be fundamentally destitute, to use an analogy. It's going to be one step, sort of half a step out of the grave. It's going to be a sort of decomposed zombie-like, whatever analogy you want to use. It's not so much the importance of the state. It is going to be disquieting to, let's say, experience that kind of feeling body. It's about the fidelity of the correspondence with the ego. So although the state is going to be very low, as long as, essentially the only problem that is going to run into the process that I'm advocating, that I'm speaking about openly here, is that the feeling body, essentially, because it's going to be in such a low state, you have to be, let's say, ready to tolerate and cope with that. And you can't do that relative to, let's say, the normal norms of functional ego, or whatever you want to call it. You kind of need a superhuman stoicism, which I think that kind of hate or whatever gives you the kind of ability to deal with that on an incremental level, in which that at the start of that journey it's going to be once you have that toolkit, once you have that necessity of, let's say, the understanding feature actuating itself through hate, you can actually imagine that you're in a privileged position, because the feeling body itself is in such disrepair that it has no attachment. And so it can construct itself with a level of freedom and liberty and ease and convenience, as it were, because it can just sort of, it can start. I mean, obviously the starting layers are going to be very banal. They're going to be almost, the problem with it is to tolerate through the dullness of actually working out, actualized, or this is not how you would do it, but this is a way of depicting the kind of things that you have to go through, the kind of common sense rationale that you would start to gain an appreciation of through dialectical behavioral therapy. And really, your biggest enemy in all of this is the sympathy that I was trying to talk about, because that kind of sympathy will just fudge the whole process. It'll just sort of, it'll congeal it. It'll make that it doesn't happen, essentially. And it'll basically say, oh, okay, no, it's too hard to function without an idolatry, especially in a community with other false egos, in which metaphysically, let's just say, everyone is running on some kind of emulated idolatry. And so, let's say the bar is quite high in comparison to the average supposedly functional human false ego, whatever. But let's just say the destitution of the narcissist, for instance, going through this kind of spiritual process, is that you don't have anything to lose, as it were. So I can still see it as an advantageous position to be in. There's less temptation, as it were. It's just the actual engagement of the process itself, or the procedure. I mean, what I'm basically talking about is a form of self-awareness, self-development, which I would generally accord to the process of salvation. The overcoming of the internal death. And anyway, I don't, I didn't say these things, but I mean, I do have lots of videos of me just talking about psychology and my model, some descriptions of my models of the sides of the mind, for instance. And yeah, I mean, the sin in the trial is basically in the ego. So when I say ego, and I'm saying that, that's your actual stream of consciousness, your actual immediate, I'm directing my thoughts. It's what is it is what is communicated when you're speaking and when you're thinking within yourself. That's the ego, the conscious part of the mind. The subconscious is like the feelings, the kind of the motivation, the dream of being propelled forward, which I would correspond with Luke's description of being drawn away by the lust and enticed. And I believe that the process of being drawn away by the lust is what I would generally call the vanity. because to be drawn away in something means that you have to sort of translate it into something. And so to be drawn away by the lust is to create a vanity about something, but you can only have a vanity with a self-identity. And so it's kind of like a it's interesting because it's almost like the synthesis of what I will later talk about in the unconscious mind. So the synthesis of everything in the unconscious mind. But it's not merely it's not idealism. It's like idealism in the context of pursuing that idealism in the world. So I always called it knowledge of the lust relative to the world. So it's not relative to your internal machinations, which like the idealism, I think. But it is very much in tune with that kind of idealism. Okay, and then the unconscious I just call the death and the lust. And the death is actually a belief. It's a belief in conditionality. Being having a condition against your own character. So having decided to believe something that then has an effect on your character dispositional, it has a kind of meta limitation on how you conduct your mind. Sorry, my voice is getting tired and I'm getting a bit sick. So and yeah, and then I believe I need to update this to some degree, but I believe that there are sort of crossovers. So there's probably a representation. I'm not going to say this because I don't have the model in front of me, but for certain. But it's essentially like there are multiple representations of those 6 elements. Many of those elements exist in 2 sides of the mind. I guess that's all I'm going to say. And I didn't even say, and the superego essentially is where the false prophet is housed, which I think has to do with the kind of valence that a child is communing with in the creation of the idolatry. Or it's a kind of the thing that initiates you into the false ego complex. And it's basically a kind of it's you talking to the future you. So it's your conceptualization of an image of your own identity, which is by its very nature hypothetical. So it's by its very nature it's an imaginative entity, and so you are communing with an imaginative entity, and by so doing, it has a kind of characterological. It implies a characterological constraint, and it's that constraint which essentially creates a rule book upon which you can extrapolate essentially, because if you have any rule, then you can have you can think about how you can break the rule or cheat the rule or whatever. And that's essentially what the lust is. The lust is the unlimited shadow which the rule essentially generates as an implicit sort of, or as a tacit correlating feature. So in the same way that things can be limited, you can use that limit in an unlimited way against everything else. So if you believe in a rule, then you can also imagine how that rule can be bent, or not even bent, but how it can be utilized in such a way that it would enable you to do anything. And this is the archetype of, for instance, the Whore of Babylon, is that the Whore of Babylon has sex with all the rich men and the kings and things like that, and has whatever she asks for. She has whatever wealth she wants, but she's not a queen. She can't claim integrity. she gets everything, and even having sex with her. It says that the rich merchants and the kings that have sex with her, they are drunk on the wrath that is caused by having sex with her. So they actually, when they have sex with her, they get angry and they're drunk. They're addicted to that anger. That is the archetypal description of the whore of Babylon. And that is exactly how the lust functions within itself, which is why when it is essentially fudged and baked into the, let's say, the extension of idealism into, like, okay, well, how are you actually going to know about the world that sort of conforms to that very internal what then becomes an unconscious sort of archetypal depiction of that. Okay, well, at the height of it, the values, the value in the world, which is the rich men and the kings of the world, are merely drunk on being angry, which they get that anger from having sex with her. So it's like, when you actually meet that highest ideal, it devalues itself. There's a lot of Nietzschean sort of parallel in Nietzschean philosophy, which I also think Nietzsche is very badly understood. The best way to understand him is to read Vasti Ruurt's paper on living with nihilism, her chapter in that book. Anyway, I'm going to put links on this recording to the Sam Vaknin parts that I think are that I'm somewhat responding to some degree, although I've used that as a huge springboard to talk about other things. And then I'll also link that paper on nihilism that I just mentioned. Okay, I'm just going to get right back into finishing one idea that was kind of left half formed. So my idea of calling, let's say, the state of that subconscious as being like a dead body or something like that, or being 1 foot out of the grave, that it's somewhat decomposed, and that it's hard to live in that kind of subconscious state. The reason why I'm calling it an advantage, again, I'm doing that kind of, I guess, unfairly to some degree, when I say that it's an advantage, because it's an advantage in a way in which, I mean, depending on how pessimistic or cynical you want to be, it's an advantage in terms of the gold standard, as it were, the ideal or whatever. The problem will essentially crop up in why it's not as great as I'm trying to sell it as, is because, is there a culture available? Because essentially that's the hardest thing about having a feeling body, is that a feeling body, I mean, feelings in general, emotions in general, I believe are essentially, if your unconscious, let's just say, is structured, if you're or to talk about a model that is post the false ego, whatever, you're going to keep track of your beliefs, which are generally represented in the unconscious side of the mind. When you have emotions, which is effectively like your subconscious antenna, it is giving you a virtual expression of how something that you're considering or contending with is impinging on your beliefs. And so people that have mixed emotions and confused emotions or muddled emotions, they have layers of different emotional responses that are perhaps, these are going to signify one of two things. It's either going to signify a kind of compartmentalization and cognitive dissonance between your belief structure, or it signifies that the input that you're getting is just far too sophisticated or confused in terms of how you can internally interface with your own beliefs. And so essentially you have to find some kind of procedure to decompress the thing that you're emotionally reacting to, so that you can process it at a slower rate in some kind of order, that you have to sort of decompose your input so that you can sort of resolve some belief structures before others are exposed to the sophisticated input that you're trying to digest with your belief system. So essentially, it's like your emotions are like your saliva in your mouth that start to break down the food and that give you some kind of feedback as to what your body is going to need to sort of do in order to do the work of completely assimilating this thing, in terms of how it's going to gel and mix with your internal composition, as a kind of vague metaphor. So so now this the thing that is actually going to create a lot of dissonance between your emotional state and your unconscious belief state is sympathy, to put it simply. They're kind of a culture of intellectual sympathy. Now, sympathy will generally always won't exist in isolation. It'll exist with a kind of exteriorized cultural, sort of mode of or an orthodoxy or a dogma of what's the word? Canonizing sympathetic themes and tropes and things like that. There are also more sophisticated ways of getting a model of that in detail, which can do some very interesting work in terms of understanding how you get systemic sort of cascades of, that can sort of relate to meme theory and to how essentially many different types of false egos that even are circuited and structured very differently can sort of work like a serial computer in some networked sense. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. And how some, let's say, karmic forms of psychic energy translate into other karmic forms of psychic energy via that kind of serial networking. But anyway, and in some sense, sympathy then can exist as almost like as a cultural construct that creates a myriad or a sort of a field of itself within itself that is kind of meta parasite on people's consciousness, and you can almost imagine these as sort of taking up a lot of space within the collective unconscious, as the reservoir of both things that can be conscious and things that will perhaps always remain unconscious to some degree, because it's sort of like a subtext. But I had a very good, I think, rudimentary definition of what the collective unconscious is. It's within the context of understanding the spirit of God and the spirit of man or whatever, you can sort of really get to grips with it, that it is all the angels and all the demons, and then depending on how willing you are to sort of take that metaphor to its conclusion, you can say that the angels can be ordered into a sort of a pristine hierarchy of value and sort of internal coherence and authority, and God is at its pinnacle, and demons can also be discerned as this sort of self-encapsulated, atrophied, self-referencing, sort of void or whatever. That would be the spirit of man, the devil, Satan or whatever. But okay, so that was a bit of a red herring. But okay, let me just get back to what was I talking about? I was talking about the unconscious mind. Why was I talking about the unconscious mind? Oh, because I was talking about emotions, and I was talking about emotions because I'm talking about how a narcissist sort of is trying to retrace or coalesce a feeling body that can be utilized and, let's say, anyway. So I understand that perhaps I should just talk about the elephant in the room more directly. So the kind of, I am talking somewhat as almost like a mix, sort of in a mix-up of a sort of internal incoherence or cross purposes. Let me just try to clear that up. So I do think that although the roles that are set up within the false ego complex between the sides of the mind are fundamentally pathological, they do have rudiments of functionality and operability, which are pale imitations of, let's say, what the basic true being would be able to order their cognition, or at least to understand and touch that cognition. So I am, saying, oh, okay, well, this is how you should resuscitate your feeling body, but it's kind of in the context of like being able to orchestrate and survey and pervade consciously your own personality style, being chosen of your own character in that sense. That deliberation itself is emphasizing your own agency and liberty to be an agent, to exercise free will as an actualized. Anyway, I don't like just ranting on about the spiritual kind of doctrinal language, because anyway. I don't like to use all the nice sort of things, but, because I just like to focus on the nuts and bolts, not on being misled by the nice sounding stuff, of how I could have depicted the true ascending man or whatever. There is a scripture that talks about the ascended man, where it talks about after having come from the depths of the earth, and it talks about the beast being under the earth, and the ascended man standing above that ground. But anyway, okay. So yeah, I mean the fundamental problem is that if you're going to, let's say, overcome the false ego, your biggest problem, your biggest obstacle, let's just say, in terms of redirecting the state of the superego which initiated the false ego complex, and the superego is somewhat one's intractable contract with the false ego. So the superego sort of has the last vestige of the original true self, and the contracted self, and I mean contracted in both senses, that it has gotten smaller and calcified and sort of crystallized this structure of the false ego complex, but that it has also this has come from, let's say, an internal deal, which is the constitution of the false ego complex. Anyway, okay, so why are we talking about the superego? And so, because of the narcissistic capture, let's just say, or colonization almost of the subconscious, this means that the idealism represented by the unconscious mind stays as a kind of ready to use implement which the superego can sort of tap into its power of idealization, which means that which is an innate power that I think the true personality has. The imagination, which conjured up even like the superego before it became properly the superego, before it contracted with the false prophet, with that valence of that future hypothetical image of the self, or whatever. So there's a way in which the power of idealization is one of the most immediate powers within the realm of the superego. If you can imagine that the unconscious exists within the superego, and then the subconscious lives within the unconscious mind, and then the ego actually kind of lives inside the subconscious, those kind of like 4 concentric circles. And in some sense, because the superego is staying so firmly in command and using the implement of the idealization in the unconscious mind, the subconscious is indirectly colonized via the power of idealization that the narcissist has from the superego, contorting the subconscious via the tool set that the unconscious sort of has, and then the ego is just sort of left with the aftermath and the residue, which is fundamentally fragmented, as it were, because of the kind of the puppet, sort of the internal puppetry being orchestrated, and treating the subconscious like a puppet. So the ego is never, because generally in, let's say, in a normal false ego development, the ego itself would actually become this upset child, because the ego actually develops within the false ego complex almost as a second tier of the false ego complex, because false ego complex is fundamentally unsustainable within itself, and the ego ends up purveying that, and it internally sees the problem. So even though it is ontologically only birthed from the false ego complex, it is a natural rebel against the false ego complex. The Matrix analogy works very well like this. That Zion and the humans that are really outside of the Matrix are part of the control system. You learn that as the history and the conspiracy that it's kind of like the rebellious thing within it, but it's sort of but it's part of the system as well, and it's part of balancing the system as well. So relative to the unconscious mind, and perhaps, and it depends if the superego is actually able to be propitiated into a state of self-dissolution, but the internal drama of all these other sides of the mind are potentially very confounding and can potentially be left unexhausted, because you need a particular procedure, you need a particular sort of way in which, anyway, okay, so I'm kind of trying to get into some of the issues of that, what that procedure entails in terms of unraveling it. But so looking at how so I think the narcissist, in some sense, the drama of unraveling the false ego and the procedure that it takes for a normal person, and I think what is actually being depicted in Revelations, which is a dream kind of archetypal process of the end of the world, the end of someone's psychological world, the collapse of, or the procedural developments that lead eventually to the dissolution of the false ego complex and its replacement with another structure, with the city of God, with the New Jerusalem. And essentially the collapse of Babylon the Great, which is kind of like the vanity structure of the false ego. Okay. So in terms of the narcissist, okay, this is slightly speculative, but the narcissist might have a leg up in all of this, might be able to process the stuff faster. What's going to really trip them up is that if there isn't, let's just say, a cultural community that is already practicing this kind of metacognition, or whatever you want to call it, or this awareness, or something like that, it doesn't already have, let's say, the authentic culture that is psychologically distinguishes itself from trading in the kind of karmic psychic drama that allows people to re-stimulate each other's false ego complexes and creates the sympathy requisite to sort of maintain everyone's, that has the requisite kind of no man's land and the requisite kind of boundaries, and because it's almost like a warring argument that never ends. If you can sort of understand how pernicious and pervasive the false ego complex operates over people, and inducts them into each other's legion and such, but to use vague metaphors, but and sympathy is a nexus of how a lot of these things get their unworkable puzzle pieces, sort of to lay, it's the scissors that allows you to cut the puzzle pieces to make them fit together. The kind of the intellectual sympathy, the cultural sympathy, just allows it to sort of just congeal and fudge and just sort of be satisfied with itself to some degree, and sort of solidify everyone in a certain sort of fudge level of self-knowledge in order to stop the disquiet that would otherwise eventually either lead to spiraling into more and more nescience, internal disarray, or making progress towards getting to the other side of it. Okay, now I think even to be able to establish a culture, it's not crowdsourced. It isn't done externally. It isn't like it's not like the sum of its parts. It's how the parts interact that is true, but how the parts interact has to be, let's say, a value that is inculcated in the individual. And other people might be able to participate in it as a mimicry, but it's not going to, I think it functions on such a high level of sophistication that breaks down very quickly if it's not actually duplicated in each individual. Anyway, the reason why I'm saying this is that I think narcissists potentially have a faster way of imbibing and developing their feeling body and structuring it, because it is in such a corpse-like state. It can be engineered from the ground up to be compatible and to be devised in such a way as to support this stuff. The problem is perhaps that there might be a lack of imagination. There might be a sort of a lack of, okay, well, actually, what should I be designing this? What it should be the purpose that it's built for? What should this feeling body be able to facilitate? And it's that kind of wide question which can be tainted, let's just say, by the low standard that the current supposed functional average represents in terms of false ego. So it's like so this sort of involves I don't know how to elegantly conceptualize it, but just to sort of illustrate it to some degree, the kind of question, I just want to be normal. What does it mean to be normal? It's like this is the sort of the tumultuous thing is that, if you don't actually have a positive ascription of value at some point that you are confident in guaranteeing yourself as an epistemic agent, if you want to rely on some kind of external factor to base some kind of supposed objectivity therein, it's not possible. You can't found something on a kind of on a collaborative that's underpinned by some kind of external idolatry, because if it doesn't exist in one person, it exists in no one. The idea that it only exists between the agreement of a certain threshold of external factors. I mean, I don't even have the energy to express just how that doesn't even operate. It doesn't even work. It cannot work. I can't necessarily. I would say, try to substantiate how it does work, and I'll dismantle it rather than trying to prove a negative. But essentially, all it has is very vacuous kinds of arguments of trying to shift the onus. I could illustrate it as the kind of as the skeptical kind of trap setter or something like that, but I don't have the energy to do that right now. But suffice to say, like right now I'm trying to contend with it in the hypothetical. Actually find me a proponent of it and I'll eviscerate them. Intellectually, obviously, I'm speaking of. I'll intellectually debunk them. Because I believe that I will intellectually debunk them. I don't know that for certain. I might be wrong. Maybe I might fail. But I don't believe I would fail. And that's an article of faith. But yeah, that's my contention. Again, you see, like that sort of substantiation only falls short if you think I should have hypothetical certainty. But I'm not contending hypothetical certainty. And you can't force me to play in that game. Because I don't need to. Because that's not where life is. That's where the mind is trying to outsmart itself or something like that. And it's only in that kind of... That is the kind of framing that the superego essentially orchestrates the false ego complex within. That is the kind of internal emotional argument which is the substance of the emotional circuitry that makes up the false ego complex. Okay, so that was a pretty good illustration, if I do say so myself. And that kind of skeptical, let's say, doubting Thomas, or whatever you want to call it, that is the valence of the false prophet. When you confront yourself with that is what the child is doing in order to create the platform or the edifice upon which the false ego complex subsists. That is what in Revelations is described as the false prophet, and which becomes the lake of fire. And it's important to have the lake of fire, because if you don't have the lake of fire, you cannot disassociate yourself from the dubious self-delusion or whatever. And sympathy goes in there, because sympathy is one of the things that creates this fudged, congealed, intellectual, sort of mediocrity, which gives everyone the leeway and the excuse to continue that kind of entertaining of the false prophet, or some of the external effects of entertaining the false prophet, because I guess sort of more detailed, but you do have to do this in sort of steps. Anyway, so this kind of stuff that I'm saying now, it might even be enough for a narcissist to sort of map on this kind of intellectual schema as, let's say, the goal, and let's say animate the feeling body towards that sort of attainment of that kind of independence, epistemic independence, as it were, internal confidence and reliance. I must say, I'm personally quite lonely myself, being surrounded by a culture which I can only describe as it's depressing. It's doubly depressing when essentially your culture is slowly being taken over by and being corroded by Nazi philosophy and totalitarian bullshit or whatever. But anyway, what's my point? But yeah, well, just the articulation, the expression, when I say expression, the actualization of a culture that dignifies the individual and the independence of the individual, on this kind of psychological depth or whatever. Having a feeling body that is sensitive to that is perhaps an exercise in vulnerability and susceptibility, because there is so much that is culturally opposed to that kind of constitution and internal schema. And that, I feel, might be too much of an independent factor that might be intolerable for a narcissist to sort of to leap that gap, as it were. But I think that might be true for anything and anyone. I mean, obviously, it would perhaps be easier if there was an organized, conglomerated, sort of organization, or something like that was striving to create a different experience, as it were, or a different ambience, a different atmosphere, that would allow people to be inducted into it. That were practicing a whole different way of life that was distinct and separate from other cultures, as it were, like other psychological cultures, to put a engaging in a kind of independent, an independent model that at least could model its superior features and virtues or whatever, so as to induct perhaps more people to join in that way. And then, under those ideal circumstances, I think the narcissist might very well find themselves at the point at which that they are on that journey of self-actualization in an enviable state of their dead feeling body, atrophied feeling body, because then it allows them essentially to construct it in some purely positive likeness of, and sort of almost scientific calibration and sort of intellectual surveying of the different possibilities within what the field implicitly sort of portends, or whatever. And I do think that in some sense the vanquishing of the superego is a virtual one. Sorry, the vanquishing of the false prophet within the superego, even the vanquishing of the false ego complex itself, becomes a virtual exercise, or is exercised by an eternal pursuit that is the way of life that is displacing it, and let's say the importance within that way of life has a substituting healing property in that it substitutes the false ego with the truth. Oh, yeah, that's a bit of a banal analogy, but yeah, it's more of a displacement. So it's like a subtextual dismantling, because in some sense it was never real, and then you just kind of see it as a kind of, it was to teach me about my own innate ability. It was to teach me about my own power of psyche, as it were. It's to teach me about my own internal capacity and facility. And to teach me, let's say, the complexity in my own ability to self-degrade and delude or whatever, and sort of like I did it to myself, and therefore it sort of reifies to some degree, or at least it what's the word, fleshes out and proves and vindicates the innate capacity that one has within one's epistemic agency and the resources of that agency, but not just the epistemic agency, also just agency in general, the articulation of one's anyway. I'm too tired to sort of extend this into more general sort of claims, but yeah, I think that's about it. Again, it could have been more elegantly phrased, but that's sort of all of the features.